provided for a bicameral legislature and an elected governor, who had power to appoint judges and other officials, control the militia, and veto legislation. The governor could serve 3 terms of 3 years each. The basic structure of Pennsylvania government changed little after 1790. The constitutions of 1838 and 1874 altered only details. Philadelphia had been the banking capital of the colonies before the American Revolution. Philadelphia merchants Robert Morris and Haym Salomon oversaw the financing of the War for Independence, making loans and negotiating foreign subsidies. After the Constitution was ratified, Philadelphia served as the national capital from 1790 to 1800 and also as the financial center of the nation. The city was the headquarters for the first and second banks of the United States, and the United States Mint was opened there in 1792. Decline of Federalist power. Pennsylvania voters at first supported the Federalist Party, which advocated a strong federal government and organized the movement to draft the United States Constitution. But they soon turned against the party, especially after President George Washington sent troops to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion by western Pennsylvania farmers in 1794. The farmers, whose livelihood depended on growing grain and distilling it into whiskey, organized resistance when the federal government imposed a tax on the liquor. Putting down the rebellion marked the first test of the federal government's law enforcement power, but it alienated most of Pennsylvania's Scots-Irish population. A similar deployment of troops, against eastern Pennsylvania Germans who resisted a property tax in Fry's Rebellion of 1799, caused that group to ally with the Scots-Irish. Together these groups became anti-federalist, actively promoted the election of Thomas Jefferson as president in 1800, and put an end to the power of the Pennsylvania Federalists. Jefferson's followers, the Democratic-Republican Party, dominated state politics so completely that 2-party contests ceased. They were replaced by struggles between factions of Jefferson's party, which came to be known simply as the Democratic Party. Pennsylvania supported the war effort during the War of 1812 to 1815, fought between Britain and the United States over the maritime rights of neutral powers. Albert Gallatin, a Pennsylvania congressman and financier, served as Secretary of the Treasury until 1814, then played a prominent role in peace negotiations that ended the conflict. In 1812 the state capital was established at Harrisburg. After the war, Pennsylvania's Jeffersonian factions agreed on many issues. They supported high tariffs to protect American industries from competition, public aid for such internal improvements as roads and canals, and a federally chartered bank. They disagreed mainly about who should hold important offices. In the disputed presidential election of 1824, voters were split between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Jackson, who gained fame as a hero in the War of 1812, portrayed himself as a champion of the common people. Although Jackson won the most electoral votes in the election, no candidate won a majority, and Adams won the presidency when the issue was decided by the House of Representatives. Pennsylvania's Jeffersonians then became 2 different parties, one favoring Adams and the other, stronger faction favoring Jackson, who won election as president in 1828. When Jackson, as president, proved an enemy to internal improvements, higher tariffs, and the Second Bank of the United States that was based in Philadelphia, he ruined many local Pennsylvania politicians. By 1835, the Jacksonians lost control of state politics to a union of the Whig Party, whose purpose was to oppose Jackson, and the Anti-Masonic Party, which formed to oppose the influence of Freemasons in politics, claiming the fraternal group was anti-democratic. In addition to Jackson's anti-bank policy, a major issue that occupied Pennsylvanians during the 1820s and 1830s was building and managing a huge state-owned network of canals and railroads, the Pennsylvania State Works. In 1834 the state established a public school system. The slavery issue. As in most northern states, Pennsylvania had strong anti-slavery sentiments from the earliest days of settlement. The Quakers had sought to abolish slavery since 1688, and in 1780 the legislature outlawed slavery. Beginning in the 1840s, slavery became the dominant political issue in the nation, and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia became centers of abolitionist activity. In 1838, abolitionists and other reform groups built Pennsylvania Hall, a meeting place dedicated to free speech, but pro-slavery rioters burned it down within days of its opening. In 1846, Pennsylvania Representative David Wilmot introduced in Congress an amendment, called the Wilmot Proviso, to exclude slavery from any territory acquired as a result of the Mexican War, 1846 to 1848. The measure heightened tensions between northern and southern states and was later adopted by the Free Soil and the Republican parties as a basic policy. The Compromise Measures of 1850, passed by Congress to reconcile pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in the country, included a strict fugitive slave law that provided for runaway slaves to be returned to their masters. When a Maryland slave owner tried to use the law in 1851 to recapture several slaves in southeastern Pennsylvania, a conflict known as the Christiana Riot broke out and the slave owner was killed. The image of armed resistance to federal authority in defense of runaway slaves foreshadowed the larger national crisis of the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Underground Railroad, a network of anti-slavery activists who helped fugitive slaves reach safety in the North, became more active in Pennsylvania, especially along the state's southern border with Maryland, which was known as the Mason-Dixon Line. In 1854 Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which authorized creation of those two territories and had the effect of repealing the 1820 ban on slavery in new territories north of the Mason-Dixon Line, or parallel 36 degrees, 30 minutes. This action so angered Pennsylvania abolitionists that they responded eagerly to the call for a new anti-slavery party. As in other states, slavery opponents in Pennsylvania held a mass meeting, which convened in Pittsburgh in 1855, to organize the Republican Party in the state. The first Republican National Nominating Convention was held in Philadelphia in June 1856. The Civil War. In 1860, the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln for the presidency. It was feared that a Republican could not win in Democratic Pennsylvania, so the Republican Party abandoned its name in Pennsylvania and presented Lincoln as the candidate of the People's Party, capturing the support of many voters who would not have voted for a Republican abolitionist. Pennsylvania Republicans split into two factions dominated by rival politicians, Andrew Gregg Curtin, elected governor in 1860, and Simon Cameron, a United States Senator. Lincoln's election and the continuing conflicts between the North and South over slavery and states' rights led to the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861. Most Pennsylvanians, regardless of their party, vigorously supported the Union. Cameron became Lincoln's first Secretary of War. In 1862 Curtin played a leading role in the Altoona Conference, where Northern governors pledged to support a national draft. In addition to its militia, Pennsylvania supplied more than 375,000 men to the Union Army and Navy. Philadelphia financier J. Cook relieved the hard-pressed Treasury Department by marketing federal bonds, raising more than $1 billion in loans for the federal government during the war. Factories in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia produced huge amounts of heavy weapons and small arms. Pennsylvania was the site of a major turning point of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, 1863. The battle, which left more than 23,000 Union casualties and at least 25,000 Confederate casualties, halted the Southern Army's invasion of the North and put it on the defensive. On November 19, President Lincoln delivered his famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, at the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery near the battlefield. Native Americans. Dozens of Native American tribes lived in the West, supporting themselves with many different economies. Tribes on the Great Plains, like the Arapaho and Sioux, were hunters and gatherers who depended on vast herds of bison. Most tribes in the Southwest, like the Pueblos, Hopis, and Navajos, were hunters and farmers. In the Pacific Northwest, tribes like the Nez Perce were traders and fishermen who relied on rivers rich with salmon. Westward expansion depleted resources and damaged the environment, thus destroying the Native Americans' ability to support them. In addition, the pioneers carried diseases that killed thousands of Native Americans. Some Native Americans resisted the influx of white settlers militarily. The most famous conflicts took place on the Great Plains, where the Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, and others fought the United States Army in several campaigns from 1855 onwards. The number of distinct Native American groups or cultures that existed at the time of European contact is more difficult to estimate. Scholars do not estimate the number of tribes that existed at the time because few Native American peoples had the level of political organization associated with true tribes. For many Native peoples, especially those who lived in areas with sparse resources, the family was the largest unit, while others were organized into bands. Some tribes did exist, but it is impossible to estimate their number, for smaller groups were constantly merging into new, larger groups, or in some cases, disappearing. Europeans applied the term nation to people with a common language and customs and a name for themselves, and by 1700, they were aware of some 50 or 60 distinct Indian nations east of the Mississippi River. The Spaniards found some 50 Indian nations in the west, including the Pueblo, Athapascan-speaking peoples, Comanche, and Piman and Yuman-speaking peoples. In the southeast and east, many Indians tried to meet the European invasion by creating confederacies or by increasing their reliance on existing confederacies of smaller groups. European settlement of the Americas drastically reduced the Native American population. The European conquest was primarily a biological one. Explorers and colonists brought a wide range of deadly communicable diseases directly from crowded European cities. These diseases spread quickly among Native Americans, who had no immunity to them. Transmitted through trade goods or a single infected person, measles, smallpox, and other diseases annihilated entire communities even before they had seen a single European. From the 16th century to the mid-19th century, 93 epidemics and pandemics, very widespread epidemics, of European diseases decimated the native population. To cite only one example, in the American Southwest, the Pueblo population fell by 90 to 95% between 1775 and 1850. In addition to smallpox and measles, explorers and colonists brought a host of other diseases: bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, pleurisy, mumps, diphtheria, pneumonia, whooping cough, malaria, yellow fever, and various sexually transmitted infections. Despite the undisputed devastation wreaked on Indian populations after European contact, native populations showed enormous regional variability in their response to disease exposure. Some peoples survived and, in some cases, even returned to their pre-contact population level. Others disappeared swiftly and completely. Today, as scholars explore the magnitude of the Native American population decline, they are finding that the issues are much more complex than was previously assumed. Archaeological evidence indicates that illness was increasing in the Native American population in many regions before the arrival of Columbus, probably in response to problems of population density, diet, and sanitation. Although the introduction of new diseases was the main cause of the rapid decline of indigenous populations, other reasons were genocide warfare, massive relocations and removals of Native Americans from their homelands, and the destruction of traditional ways of life. With white encroachment on their land, Native Americans no longer had access to their traditional hunting, gathering, and farming areas. Their subsistence patterns broke down, leading to malnutrition and greater susceptibility to disease. Relocation to new areas, often among hostile Indian tribes that were already living there, meant that people demoralized by their circumstances had to establish new subsistence patterns as well as come to terms with their forced dependency. Northeast peoples hunted a variety of game, large and small, deer, rabbit, squirrel, beaver, and various birds, such as turkey, partridge, duck, and goose. Peoples of the northern woods also hunted moose, elk, and bear. Some peoples living near the prairies of the Mississippi River Valley hunted the North American bison, or buffalo. In addition to hunting with spears, bows and arrows, and clubs, Northeast Indians used traps, snares, and deadfalls, traps designed to cause heavy objects, such as logs, to fall, disabling or killing prey. They used disguises to get close to animals, lured prey with animal calls, and set fires to drive animals toward hunters or traps. Northeast Indians also fished rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds. They caught fish with harpoons, hooks, nets, and traps. Peoples living along the Atlantic coast depended on shellfish for part of their diet. Wild plant foods were also an important food source, including berries, nuts, roots, stalks, and leaves. Some tribes along the western Great Lakes collected a tall grass with an edible grain, referred to as a wild rice. Peoples living in maple country collected sap from the trees in early spring and boiled it down into maple syrup and sugar. Most Northeast peoples supplemented a hunting-gathering diet with farming. The Iroquois thought of their three most important crops: maize, corn, beans, and squashes as the three sisters, and planted them together on small earthen hills. Corn stalks supported the vines of bean plants, while the large-leafed squash plants served to block weed growth. Algonquian peoples introduced the Pilgrims and other early settlers in their homelands to these cultivated crops, in addition to many wild foods, including maple sugar, cranberries, blueberries, lobsters, clams, and oysters. The family played an important role in Northeast Indian society. Most tribes were further organized into clans, clusters of related families who claimed a common ancestor. Clans often took animal names, such as the Deer Clan or Bear Clan. The Iroquois were a matrilineal society, with descent and property passing through the female line. Each clan was headed by an elder woman, known as a clan mother. Clan mothers owned the crops and the communal dwellings and held great political power. They elected tribal chiefs, who were generally male, retained the right to veto actions they opposed, and had to approve declarations of war. Unlike the Iroquois, the Algonquian were a patrilineal society, with descent and property traced through the male line. To reduce conflict and maintain unity against enemies, Northeast tribes organized into a number of confederacies. The Iroquois Confederacy, also called the League of Five Nations, helped its member tribes achieve great power and long-term political stability. The Confederacy was founded by the late 1500s, possibly earlier, and was composed of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. It became known as the League of Six Nations after the Tuscarorum migrated to the area from present-day North Carolina and formally joined the Confederacy in 1722. Central to the alliance was a deliberative council composed of delegates from all the member tribes. Clan mothers selected a proportion of the delegates to the council, and many procedures were established in a constitution that was passed down orally from generation to generation. Confederacies were also common among the Algonquian tribes, although they were less tightly organized than the Iroquois Confederacy. Some Algonquian alliances resulted from the abilities of a single strong leader, such as Chief Powhatan of the Powhatan Confederacy. Other Algonquian confederacies included the Abenaki Confederacy, Delaware Confederacy, Wampanoag Confederacy, and the Wappinger Confederacy. Some Northeast Indians maintained permanent villages. Other peoples were semi-nomadic, changing village sites depending on food availability. They made clearings in the woods, usually near streams or rivers, and sometimes surrounded them with palisades, tall walls made from sharpened logs stuck upright in the earth, for defensive purposes. Two types of houses were common in the Northeast, the Iroquoian longhouse and the Algonquian wigwam. The region's vast forests provided the main building materials for these shelters. Northeast peoples frequently relied on birch bark canoes for transporting people and provisions in waterways. Algonquian peoples crafted them using a framework of cedar or spruce wood and a covering of birch bark. They sewed pieces of bark together with spruce root, and then sealed the seams with melted spruce gum. These elegant boats drew little water, making them well suited for navigating shallow lakes, rivers, and streams. Light and strong, birch bark canoes could be carried easily overland, making them advantageous for hunting or raiding expeditions. Iroquoians used heavier elm bark instead of birch bark to cover their canoe frameworks. Deerskin was the material of choice for clothing before Europeans brought cotton and other trade goods into the Northeast. Treated and softened hide was used for shirts, leggings, dresses, skirts, breechcloths, and moccasins. Northeast Indians also made robes and mittens from beaver and bear fur. To decorate clothing they used feathers, shells, stones, paint, and porcupine quill embroidery. Northeast Indians believed in a spirit world that interacted with the physical, or natural, world. This included belief in a primary spirit, a great animating force that pervaded all existence. Algonquians called this animating force Kitch Manitou, Great Spirit, or simply Manitou, and by other names depending on language dialects. The Iroquoian version of Manitou is known as Orenda, among other names, and Siouans referred to it by variations on Wakan, or Wakanda. According to indigenous beliefs, the Great Spirit had many manifestations. It was believed to be present in all things animals, plants, water, rocks, and other natural phenomena, such as the sun, moon, weather, or sickness. Lesser manifestations of the Great Spirit were sometimes referred to as Manitous or by other names, such as Thunderbird, bringer of rain. Shamans were believed to be capable of controlling these spirits. Apart from a general belief in the Great Spirit, Algonquian tribes had different legends and believed in different supernatural beings. Some of these beings were considered heroes or guardian spirits, such as Main Boss Ho, the Great Hare, who, according to the legends of the Ojibwe and other Algonquian tribes, remade the world after bad spirits had destroyed it in a flood. Medicine societies, composed of practitioners skilled in the arts of healing, were important among many Northeast peoples. These societies sought the help of the spirit world and dispensed herbal cures to ward off disease and heal the sick. One of the most famous Northeast medicine societies was the Medwivin, Grand Medicine Society, which originated among the Ojibwe and spread to other Great Lakes Algonquians. Members, known as Mids, served a long apprenticeship before gaining admittance to the society. Separate apprenticeships were necessary to attain the 4 ranks of Mids, each of which was associated with ever greater supernatural powers. Members of the False Face Society of the Iroquois wore wooden masks known as false faces. The masks, which represented spirits known as faces of the forest, were carved on a living tree. Then a ceremony of prayer and tobacco offering was held while the masks were cut from the trunk. The masks were believed to frighten away malevolent spirits that caused illness, and false face dances were performed to heal the sick. Some Northeast coastal peoples may have had contacts with non-Native Americans as early as about AD 10,000, when Vikings sailing from Iceland attempted to found colonies in North America, including at least one settlement in what is now Newfoundland and Labrador. The first known contacts with later European explorers occurred in the 1500s. However, it was not until the 1600s that European influences began to alter significantly indigenous ways of life. Trade goods, including iron tools and pots, brightly colored clothing, glass beads, and firearms, spread throughout the region at varying rates depending on the location of tribes. Many groups maintained something close to their traditional ways of life for generations, even with the new tools and materials. European goods were incorporated into Aboriginal technologies, art forms, and rituals. However, alcohol was one trade good that rapidly and consistently proved detrimental to tribal identity. The spread of European diseases also led to significant loss of life among Northeast peoples, as it did throughout North America. Patterns of non-Indian expansion in present-day eastern Canada, much of which was once a part of New France, the French Empire in North America, was less disruptive than they were further south. The economy of New France revolved around the fur trade, which began with the voyages of French explorer Jacques Cartier in the 1530s. The French